On. Anyway, our reading tonight is from Luke 10. I don't know how Jess manages to do it, but every time she gets one that gets me, thank you very much. So hopefully I can get through this okay. This actually was something I referenced in when I gave a speech at Pride this year. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise."
I have a reading from Matthew 5. You have heard that it was said, "Love your neighbor and hate your enemy." But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect.
I want to do this just because I think it'll be fun. Snap with me. Off, on, up, down, left, right. I'm going to keep going. See if you can say the second one with me. Just anticipate what it is. North, south, light, dark, gay, straight, male, female, religious, secular, self, other, orange. No. Okay. Fantastic rhythm, by the way. Orange, yes. The world is made up of opposites. Everything we've ever seen on a computer is ones and zeros, these binaries. Music is sound waves made of beats, and the vibrations between the on and off, the faster the on-off, the higher the pitch. Is there a me without you? Is there an us without them? Is there a conception of good without necessitating a conception of evil? Why does the binary way of experiencing reality exist? And how does it influence our experience of the world together? Because we can't even ask the question, who are we, without also asking the implicit question, who aren't we? Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader. Harry Potter, Voldemort. Marty McFly, Biff Tannen. Or the Libyans, depending how hard you want to push that one. John McClane, Hans Gruber. I wanted to go deeper, but we're not going to go that way. The way our consciousness works, the way evolutionary biology and psychology have arrived at me and have arrived at you, the human psyche self-narrates a story which always sets us up as the hero and always sets up anyone who opposes us as the enemy. Right? This is a gift of evolutionary biology and psychology. This is not a bad thing that any of you have done. We inherited this. And on the eve of another election, in one of the most tumultuous political environments we can recall, Jim pointed out this week, it's often difficult, many of you just said this, to understand people's beliefs and opinions, which are widely divergent from our own. And there may be this sort of psychological incentive not to even make an attempt to take their belief or perspective seriously. Me hero, you enemy, right? We do these binaries. For one thing, doing this might diminish our own certainty, which is really uncomfortable, to call into question what we think we know. It could complicate a belief that we've thought was very simple. And then there's the temptation to dismiss or demonize or shoot or bomb the person because maybe it just feels better. And maybe the demonization relates to this cosmic struggle, again, good and evil. And certain people may feel like violence is justified because it's in some sense the defending of goodness. So how do we deal with violence and enmity, hate, prejudice, sex, race, homo, trans, every ism and phobia that results in the tearing of me from you, the severing of us from them? Jesus is asked, who is my neighbor? And he answers with a story about a man traveling who gets mugged, and the religious leader and then the religious lackey pass up helping this man because of their religious rules about cleanliness and about blood and about death and about touching. And then a Samaritan comes along. Nick, come up for a second. This is going to be fun. You guys can help me hold Nick accountable. Nick's settings are either teach about Samaritans for 3 hours or teach about Samaritans for 3 days. So I gave him 3 minutes.
The three I recognize.
Yeah, sort of an expert. So tell us about the enmity between Samaritans and the people Jesus would have been talking to.
Sure, and my wife did laugh out loud when she found out you
And
gave me
sent
3
me an
minutes
email.
to talk about
3
anything.
minutes?
So I refer to this as the original denominationalism. To understand what it means to be historically Samaritan, we also need to consider what it means to be historically Jewish during the time that Jesus knew both people groups. Consistently, Samaritans have insisted to be ancestral descendants from 10 of the 12 tribes of Hebrews led by Moses. They generally identify with tribes of Ephraim, Manasseh, and Levi, all tribes with links to ancient Samaria. Contrarily, Jewish people would have identified exclusively with the tribe of Judah. To be Jewish meant to be a descendant of the tribe of Judah, a practitioner of Judaism, and hence a Jew. While in contrast, Samaritans practiced their own unique Hebrew expression known as Samaritanism. We are describing original denominationalism. The most obvious issue between these groups has always been the location of the chosen place to worship publicly. The Temple on the Mount in Jerusalem, according to Jewish expression, versus Mount Gerizim, according to the Samaritan expression, which increasingly becomes a context of a philosophical conversation between Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. Another interesting difference, the Samaritans, while devoted to the practices of Moses, prefer the original 5 books of Moses and avoid the other books merited by the Jewish tribe, such as Psalms and Proverbs. Now, the third, lesser understood difference is rooted in hatred and bigotry. 1,000 years before the Common Era, a civil war occurred between the tribe of Judah and the other 10 northern tribes. a precipitation that was caused by Solomon, who consolidated power in Judah and built a national temple in Jerusalem. This war permanently divided the Hebrews into two groups: historically authentic kingdom in Samaria versus the newer Jewish kingdom and temple. Simultaneously, the Samaritan Hebrews intermarried with the indigenous and the Neo-Assyrian neighbors, while the people of Judah aspired for pure breeding. This intermarrying versus eugenic purity becomes a source of bigotry between the groups. The Jewish people Jesus knew would have viewed the Samaritans as half-breeds. Now, you mentioned Harry Potter.
Yes. Come
Well,
on, then. You
as-
get an extra 30 seconds. Go.
As fans of Harry Potter, we know the term half-breed is an insult to half-human wizards who are repulsed to full-blood wizards. I think of Dolores Umbridge, who despised her Muggle mother and Squib brother, considered them inferiors, and denounced them. Samaritans and half-breed wizards share a metaphor. To be Samaritan was to be hated and denounceable, and Jesus despised this thinking. Frankly, he may have been aware of his own genealogy that includes non-Hebrew genetic groups in his personal history. His ancestor included Muggles and Squibs. In many ways, Jesus was one of those abominations, a half-blood prince, ill-bred and the Harry Potter of his own time. It's motivating for me to know that Jesus would have been personally experienced and influenced by injustice, bigotry, and denominationalism. Perhaps this is why he spoke of the Samaritans with fondness and to them inclusively. He acknowledged a shared history and shared anticipation for the Messiah. And so, speaking of magic, I question myself. How do I seek the deeper magic referenced by C.S. Lewis? A magic that is capable of overcoming injustice, yet mindful of a destiny that is shared with a community where some see me as friend or a neighbor or perhaps their enemy.
Damn. Woo. Ladies and gentlemen, Nick just got put on the preaching roster. That's a turducken of sermons. That's a sermon in a, or that's like a Russian nesting doll of sermons. We're going to give you another hand. That was fantastic. Thank you. Woo. Wow. So they're mortal enemies. Now, the fundamental structure of the story is what's called a rule of three. So this is used in a lot of jokes. The first person is random, second person establishes a pattern, the third person comes along and they're the exception, the punchline, the surprise. So there's a pessimist and an optimist and a realist, and they walk into a tunnel. The pessimist sees only darkness, the optimist sees the light at the end of the tunnel, the realist sees that the light is a train. And yours can be whatever you want, a blonde, a brunette, a redhead, a priest, an imam, and a rabbi. It all works the same, and Jesus is using the same rule of three structure that's been a part of storytelling since before religion was religion. The surprise in this story is really interesting because it's twofold. The first is this: the mortal enemy of the Israelites, the Samaritan, helps the man in need. And remember, we always assume that we're the hero in the story, and so the audience that Jesus was speaking to would have assumed that the man in the story who was beaten and in need of help was one of them. So surprise, the enemy helps the neighbor. That's surprise number one. Much more shocking, the enemy is the neighbor. Because most often the story is told as if the beaten man in need is the neighbor. As if Jesus is saying, and rightly so, don't let your religion, your religious rules, get in the way of helping someone in need who's on the side of the road. But Jesus asks at the end of the story, which of these do you think was the neighbor to the man who fell among robbers, right? So the man who's beaten and in need on the side of the road, the way Jesus is telling the story, he's not the neighbor. Someone else in the story is the neighbor. When the expert in the law asks, who is my neighbor, he might be expecting Jesus to say something as radical as, a man who is beaten and bloody, and a man who may be dead, and a man who may be a Gentile. We don't know. All of these could make a priest and a Levite unclean. And so it would have been radical for Jesus even just to say, you should help this man who's in need. But instead, Jesus doubles down and he answers, who is my neighbor by saying the neighbor is not the man in need beaten in the road. The neighbor is the Samaritan. Who is my neighbor? Here is your enemy. Who is my neighbor? Here's your enemy. There's this great Romanian parable in which a shepherd is such a good shepherd that an angel of God comes and visits and says, God is so pleased with the way that you've been shepherding that God is going to give you anything you want. And hold on, it gets better. Not only is God going to give you anything you want, God is going to give your neighbor double whatever you get. And the shepherd says, then take one of my eyes. June, yesterday we were playing at Freedom Playground. We went to the Wily Owl and got these little thinking putty things. They're like glitter and glow in the dark. They're like $3. Huck immediately lost his. June lost hers. So I said, okay, she's losing her mind. We'll go back to Wily Owl. We'll get another one. I said, we'll get you one, and then we'll also let Huck pick one out, because I had picked his out. So when I said, we'll get you one, she's like, yeah, awesome. Let's leave right now. Let's go get it. When I said, we'll let Huck pick one out also, she goes, what? No, I don't want one. I'd rather not get one than him get two. Where does this enmity come from? Where does this terror that someone that we might otherwise love, even our literal brother, having more, getting more, having at our expense, succeeding while we not even fail, but maybe just do less so? How does this turn someone we might love into an enemy? And then is Jesus so crazy to answer the question, who is my neighbor, with, here's your enemy? You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your neighbor and your enemy. And I think our initial response is probably, nah, this is ridiculous, right? And we might even say, Jesus, you've said lots of really good, important, moral, unique, formative, spiritual things that we ought to follow, and we ought to try and live up to, and we ought to desire, but this makes no sense. How do we love someone who's actively trying to do us harm our tribe, harm our community, harm the common good of our commonwealth? As if this wasn't preposterous enough, just before this in Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. There's some really cool sort of contextual jujitsu here where Jesus is saying that in turning the other cheek, you force the slapper to humanize you. Essentially, the deal is you're making them use their toilet paper hand to slap you a second time, which is an insult to them. By turning the cheek, they can't use the same hand to slap you. They have to use what was considered the lower class hand. And everyone wipes their ass. You force the person to come at you as an equal. They lose their posture of superiority, which is very cool. But the thing that I can't seem to shake, I've read this so many times this week, the thing I can't shake is this. In the story, the enemy is close enough to slap us. Just think about that. Think about the world we find ourselves in. As cool as the context thing is that Jesus does in humanizing, this is the thing that I can't get past. The enemy is close enough to slap us. I want to be very clear. I'm in no way condoning abusive relationships, knowingly putting yourself in harm's way, ever allowing any form of assault. But I wonder what it means, metaphorically or symbolically, to get close enough. What are the things that keep us safely out of slapping range? Social media, echo chambers, insular friend groups, communities, political parties, neighborhoods, school districts, our own politeness at Thanksgiving, like, let's not discuss that because I see Aunt Tilda warming up her backhand. We're not going to do it, right? Given the opportunity, most of the time, we will step out of slapping range. What are the divisions that have to be overcome so we can get close enough for a slapping. And again, not physical violence. I'm not advocating that. But choosing to step into enough direct interpersonal conflict with our enemy that we might actually see them, close enough that we could look them in the eye, that they might see us, that we might feel it, and it might hurt a little bit, that we might get embarrassed, that we might be forced to deal in space and time with how it feels to say these words to another person. Uninsulated by 144 characters or avatars or backlit screens, complete with an eager audience that we know will stand up and cheer for the damage we can do to another person. What does it mean to get close enough? And also, how might we non-violently help the enemy to humanize us? That's such a significant part of what Jesus does. What is today's version of turning the other cheek? How would we intentionally, graciously, generously, lovingly, peacefully, non-violently, non-passive aggressively help our enemy to see us as a person not so different from them, with more in common than that which divides us? Tuesday is election day. Those of us who haven't already, please, please, please go to the polls. Tuesday matters. Voting matters. Participation matters. And we load Tuesday, we load decision days, we load election days with such fervor and anxiety and such invested energy. And it begins to me to feel like we think that this will be a rare day of agency in an otherwise impotent life. And I hope it's not. I really, really hope it's not. I sincerely hope that Tuesday will be another day of agency in a lifetime of agency. And that you already have, or that you will speak loudly, and that you will speak with one voice for love. For love. That you'll vote love. And that in the same way, you will then daily exercise the agency of the ballots of your time and your energy and your money and your relationships and the many other unique gifts that you have. Jim said most, if not everyone at Collective, are already involved in some way in making their neighborhood, making their world a better place. They'll do it on the Monday before. They'll do it on the Wednesday after. For people who have this stance, the election might adjust their focus, it may encourage, it may discourage, but their efforts will continue. Our efforts will continue. Tuesday, like so many other days, we will be reminded of the binaries. We will be spoon-fed the list of opposing binaries on a ballot. Republican, Democrat, red, blue, good, bad, right, wrong, me, you, us, them. We will be reminded of our enemies. We'll engage in caricaturing and demonizing and dehumanizing people who are actually, at the end of the day, people. Human beings. Not so different from us. The ones who we disagree with most, the ones for whom it is easiest for us to hate, they may be people with hopes. They may be people with desires. They may have ambitions and passions like us. They may even have dreams for how the world could be, and they may see the way that they could contribute to the world being better. Many of them are people who are as afraid and uncertain and paralyzed as we are. Can it get better? Can we afford for it to get worse before it gets better? We're acutely aware of our enemies. But we have to keep in mind, as the author of the letter to Ephesians puts it, we fight not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world. Can I get an amen? Against spiritual wickedness in high places. Where are our... Our deepest enmity is not with people. Our deepest enmity is with systems. We take to the polls to battle system. At Wild Goose Festival this summer, a guy named Doug Padgett was speaking, and he was advocating political activism, flipping Congress with this group. He actually took this really popular, huge Christian conference group and converted the entire thing to an organization called Vote Common Good. They've been traveling the country, lobbying to flip Congress. And he said, look, we've got to remind ourselves of the humanity of Trump. He's a person, which means whatever we think or feel, he's a person, deserving of the same respect and dignity, sacred worth and value as any other person. We all just happen to know he shouldn't be president. Maybe loving our enemies begins with reminding ourselves again that it is okay to stand for something, to stand for justice, to renounce behaviors, to renounce actions, to renounce corrupt systems, and to allow people to remain people. To stand for justice, goodness, dignity, equity, and to stand for that of God in everyone. I think maybe progressive Christianity has deconstructed so much of the extreme challenge of Christianity to recognize that of God in everyone. Maybe we've deconstructed so much of it that it's allowed us to hate again. I think perhaps it's time for Christianity to deconstruct the hate, to figure out what it means to lead again in love, to never leave an encounter with an enemy without finding that of God in the enemy. And this isn't handed down from a noble tradition that's figured this out. This is lived up from grassroots, gritty, school of love, failing and failing and failing until we almost figure it out. Somebody said at Occupy Tuesday, actually I think it was Nick, hatred has to cost more than love. And hate is cheap right now, right? The market is full. There's as much hate as you could possibly want, and it costs nothing. It's cheap. And he clarified, it has to cost me more. Hate has to cost me more than love. And I think Christianity may be a way for us to call hate into question, to make it cost more, to make love the more excellent way. We're acutely aware of our enemies. We're also acutely aware that it feels as if the world hangs in the balance. We're acutely aware that in this particular political season of how bad things are, we're more afraid than we've ever been. And hear me, some fear is justified because we might kill the planet if we don't reverse course. We might do irreparable damage to global citizenship if we don't make dramatic political changes. We might set back civil and human rights if we don't demand change. Some fear is justified, and it should motivate us to act. I can't stress enough before I say what I'm about to say, before we end the way that we're about to end. You must vote. You must be active. You must call this political system and our leadership to higher and better work, to heed the voices of our better angels. We cannot let up on the pressure for change. It is more important than it has ever been. And it is also my spiritual responsibility in the life of this congregation and your spiritual responsibility in the parish in which we find ourselves, DeLand, Central Florida, to offer comfort, to offer peace, offer hope in the midst of fear, in the midst of helplessness, in the midst of raging turmoil. So here's where I want to end. Because I also think this experience, not this theology, not this idea, not this intellectual exercise, but this experience can ease us into healthy non-attachment. It can help us to experience what it means to surrender outcomes. And I think that is at the core of transforming enemies back into neighbors. And this is it. This is not new. This is very, very, very old. All is well. All is well. And all manner of things will be well. From Julian of Norwich. All is well. All is well. All manner of things will be well. You don't have to believe it, but listen. All is well. All is well. And all manner of things will be well. If you're willing to, even if you don't believe it, but you want to believe it, can we say this together? All is well, and all manner of things will be well. Shut your eyes. All is well, and all manner of things will be well. For me, this is an expression of surrender, non-attachment, hope. Eckhart Tolle says, true surrender is something entirely different. It does not mean to passively put up with whatever situation you find yourself in and do nothing about it, nor does it mean to cease making plans or inviting positive action. Surrender is the simple but profound wisdom of yielding to, rather than opposing, the flow of life. Yielding to, rather than opposing, the flow of life. What might it mean? Might it look like? Might it feel like for us to choose not to oppose? That is, not to be an enemy of the flow of life. All is well. All is well, and all manner of things will be well. Jim shared at Occupy Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. It shares these statistics that show that life is becoming less brutal. We might say that all manner of things is trending toward well. Toward a phrase that Jim is fond of, lovely developments. War and genocide in the 20th century is 9 times less deadly than tribal warfare. The murder rate is 30 times less than that in medieval Europe. Slavery, sadistic punishments, even with waterboarding and black hole prisons, frivolous executions have been greatly reduced. In many ways, things are better than they've ever been. Despite these facts, it doesn't appear people on the whole are feeling very relieved or optimistic. The U.S. is clearly more polarized than it's ever been. And maybe we need the reminder that many things are actually trending toward the better, that there is cause for hope. Now, in the U.S., that's not the case. And that's okay, because part of what that symptom points out is that we have to deal with our nationalistic ego. And that's painful, and it's not fun, but it's good. And globally, things are better. All is well. All is well, and all manner of things will be well. David shared this last week. I don't do French, but Antoine de Saint-Exupéry says, love does not consist in gazing at each other, but in looking outward together in the same direction. What would happen if we changed the metaphor from across the aisle to something that would put us not head to head in battle, but would put us shoulder to shoulder, problem solving? This ability is not lost. Love is still possible because the love of power is still not as powerful as the power of love. The love of power executed an itinerant rabbi who preached the presence of Spirit and the power of love. And we're not here tonight talking about the glory of the Roman Empire that executed him, but about the humble goodness and self-giving love and sacrificial, enemy-loving work of an open table. Not about beating into submission, but about beating swords into plowshares, into instruments that cultivate goodness, vitality. We're not singing about breaking bodies and shedding blood to get our way, to prop up our agenda, but about the kind of change, the kind of world, the kind of God embodied in human community when we're willing to give our body, when we're willing to shed our blood for a life worth living, for values worth living and dying for spirituality worth practicing, and for community worth belonging to. All is well. All is well. And all manner of things will be well. This is the table that's been set for us tonight. As always, it's open to us and to all people. And no one will ever be turned away. We all have enemies. No one. Picture them. Imagine how it would feel if they were to walk up to the table with you. No one will ever be turned away. It can't be sentiment. It's too important. It's our responsibility to wrestle this through, figure out what that means here. Sit with that a moment. When you're ready, feel free to come and grab a piece of bread and dip it in the cup.